During our annual Thanksgiving feast, my younger brother boldly stood up, tapped a silver spoon against his crystal goblet, and declared with an insufferable smirk that our parents had quietly transferred the ownership of my self-built company entirely to him. He stared me down and stated that I was formally dismissed from my position, destined to leave with absolutely nothing. In response, I took a deliberate, slow sip of my vintage Merlot, locked eyes with my father, and simply asked if I should break the news to them now, or if he wanted the privilege. My name is Alina, and I am 34 years old. I never imagined that my own flesh and blood would attempt to hijack my life's work right over a bowl of cranberry sauce. Before I delve deeper into this tale, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to this channel if you have ever needed to outmaneuver toxic relatives who mistakenly believed they could easily trample all over you. Believe me, you will want to find out exactly how I dismantled their pathetic corporate takeover without ever raising my voice. The dining room was heavily perfumed with the rich scents of roasted turkey and herb stuffing, yet the air felt incredibly suffocating. We were gathered at my parents' sprawling estate in an affluent suburb for what was supposed to be a picture-perfect Thanksgiving meal. The vintage chandelier cast a golden, radiant light over the expensive porcelain, projecting the ultimate illusion of a loving family. However, beneath that polished veneer, I was sitting in a shark tank. For the past 10 years, I had poured my absolute heart and soul into OmniFlow Logistics, a premier supply chain management agency I built entirely from scratch. I gave up my 20s, abandoned vacations, and routinely pulled 90-hour workweeks to transform it into a wildly lucrative enterprise. Sitting directly across from me was my 31-year-old brother, Cameron. He was sporting an absurdly overpriced designer suit that he certainly couldn't afford on his own dime. Cameron was the quintessential golden child. While I was constructing a legitimate empire, he was bouncing between failed entrepreneurial schemes, always running back to our parents to rescue him from his catastrophic financial blunders. Seated beside him was his wife, Simone, an intensely ambitious and sharp African-American luxury real estate agent who always treated me like a pesky hurdle rather than family. We had just wrapped up the main course when Cameron raised his fork, clinking it loudly against his wine glass. The piercing noise sliced through the quiet dinner chatter. He rose to his feet, expanding his chest, completely demanding the attention of the room. My mother, Margaret, gazed up at him with blind adoration, while my father, Arthur, settled deeply into his leather chair. As everyone here is aware, OmniFlow has expanded exponentially in recent years, Cameron began. But to elevate it to the next tier, the company requires genuine leadership, a formidable masculine presence to guide the ship forward. He paused for dramatic effect. Mom, Dad, and I had a lengthy discussion regarding the family legacy. They have come to the conclusion that for this family's wealth to be truly shielded and maximized, the enterprise must be controlled by the son. I gently placed my silverware onto my plate. What exactly are you implying, Cameron? I inquired, ensuring my tone remained utterly flat. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, retrieving a thick legal envelope, and tossed it carelessly onto the center of the table, right beside the gravy boat. What I am telling you, Alina, is that Mom and Dad have officially signed their 51% controlling stake in OmniFlow Logistics directly over to me, he boasted proudly. As of yesterday morning, I am the majority owner. My first official executive decision as the new CEO is to notify you that your services are no longer required. You have until Monday to empty your desk. I will personally have security march you out if you attempt to steal any confidential files. A heavy silence swallowed the room. Simone grinned, eyeing the legal paperwork like she had just struck gold. My mother reached across the table to affectionately pat Cameron's arm before turning her calculating, icy gaze toward me. We just feel it is the right time for you to step aside, Alina, Margaret said in a sickeningly sweet tone. You are 34 and still unmarried. Managing a corporation is far too taxing for a woman of your age. Cameron has a wife, and he needs to provide for his household. You really should be thrilled for your brother. I glanced at the stack of documents resting by the gravy boat, looked up at my incredibly smug brother, and merely smiled. Simone interpreted my smile as a reaction of pure shock. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished mahogany, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the chandelier's light. She let out a patronizing little laugh and lifted her glass. "I already have a high-end interior decorator scheduled for Tuesday morning, Alina," Simone remarked, taking a delicate sip. "That corner office of yours has always been so dreadfully bleak. It needs a total revamp now that a legitimate executive is taking over. We are envisioning rich mahogany paneling, genuine leather seating, and perhaps a bespoke wet bar. Cameron requires an environment that commands absolute respect when he hosts elite clients. It's strictly business, you understand." I said absolutely nothing. I simply picked up the serving spoon and calmly added another portion of sweet potato casserole to my plate. The total absence of panic on my face clearly aggravated my sister-in-law. She was desperately hoping for tears. She wanted me to plead, scream, or hurl a glass in a hysterical meltdown. Instead, I sliced a piece of turkey, dipped it in cranberry sauce, and chewed with perfect composure. Simone's eyes narrowed as she escalated her verbal attack. "Let us be completely honest, Alina. You are 34 years old and entirely alone. No husband, no kids, and frankly, no identity beyond that dusty warehouse. It's actually quite pitiful to witness. It is high time a true family man took the wheel of this operation. Cameron has a baby on the way. He is building a legacy." "What are you building for? A future filled with stray cats?" I swallowed my bite and stared directly into her eyes. Simone was a remarkably successful broker who dealt in multi-million-dollar estates for elite buyers. She was intelligent, ruthless, and fiercely determined. However, she had made one catastrophic error when she married my brother. She assumed our family possessed generational wealth. She saw the sprawling suburban mansion, the imported vehicles, and the prestigious country club memberships, automatically assuming Cameron was heir to a dynasty. She had no clue that I was the one footing the bill for the country club. She had no idea Cameron was essentially a trust fund baby without an actual trust fund, surviving entirely on our parents' endless enabling of his delusions. "You should really look at this as a gift," Simone added, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Cameron is prepared to offer you a very generous severance package out of the goodness of his heart. 2 months of your current salary. Take that cash and finally go on a trip. Fly to Bali or Tuscany. Do one of those spiritual retreats. Find yourself a man who can actually handle a woman with such intense, masculine energy, because hiding behind a desk managing logistics has clearly ruined your personal life." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "Simone is entirely correct, darling. We are doing this for your own benefit, so please do not make a scene. You've been looking so exhausted and old lately. Those dark circles under your eyes are just awful. Now you can focus on softening your image. Perhaps you could join my botanical society or take up culinary classes." I took another incredibly slow, deliberate bite of my meal. The turkey was painfully dry, but the psychological warfare unfolding at this table was absolutely delectable. They were all sitting on the edge of their seats, anticipating a massive emotional breakdown. My father, Arthur, sat back with his arms folded across his chest, playing the part of the silent, omnipotent patriarch who had just executed the ultimate masterstroke. He genuinely believed he had outmaneuvered me, utilizing the very empire I bled for to set his golden child up for life. Cameron smirked, drumming his fingers aggressively against the wood. "So, are we going to do this the easy way or the difficult way, Alina? I have an independent security firm on standby to pack up your personal belongings this weekend. You won't even have to show your face in the building and humiliate yourself. Just hand over your company laptop and the office keys right now, and we can conclude this lovely Thanksgiving dinner as a family. No hard feelings." I meticulously placed my knife and fork onto my plate, aligning them perfectly parallel. I picked up my linen napkin and gracefully dabbed the corners of my mouth. The silence in the dining room was pulled as tight as a bowstring. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound. I glanced down at the legal papers near the gravy boat once more. The official transfer of ownership, the 51% majority stake. The magical document they assumed was their golden ticket to the immense fortune I had painstakingly built over 10 grueling years. I shifted my gaze to Simone, whose perfectly contoured face was locked in a mask of arrogant triumph. She truly believed she would be waking up on Monday as the wife of a millionaire CEO. She was already spending the corporate revenue in her imagination. She was already picking out the elite private academy for her unborn baby, visualizing the European luxury cruises and reveling in the social press. Age of owning Omni-Flow logistics. It was almost a tragedy to shatter her meticulously constructed fantasy. Almost. My father finally repositioned himself in his chair, making the vintage wood groan beneath his weight. He rested his large hands over his stomach, flashing me a look of pure, unadulterated victory. For my entire existence, Arthur had viewed me not as a child, but as a high-yield asset. When I was a kid, I was the trophy he paraded around to show off my academic accolades. When I launched Omni-Flow Logistics, I transformed into the dependable workhorse that generated the massive cash flow he loved to boast about at his exclusive dinners. But in his archaic worldview, a daughter was never destined to wear the crown. That privilege belonged strictly to the male heir. "You need to look at the macro perspective here, Alina," my father rumbled with pseudo-authority. "You built a respectable little operation. We are all quite proud of you, but you have hit your ceiling. You lack the aggressive, masculine instinct necessary to scale a nationwide supply chain network. Cameron has it. He possesses the vision and the killer instinct. We are simply stepping in to safeguard the family asset before your overly cautious strategies run it into the ground." I sat completely still, watching him justify the blatant theft of my life's work with the casual indifference of a man returning a slightly defective sweater to a boutique. He fundamentally believed his own garbage. He believed that my decade of agonizing labor, skipped holidays, sleepless nights, and battles with corporate predators was merely a warm-up act for Cameron to swoop in and claim the glory. My mother nodded vigorously, topping off her glass with a heavy pour of white wine. "Your father is completely right," she chimed in, her expensive bracelets clinking. "You should actually be thankful we allowed you to play businesswoman for this long. Most families would never have been so infinitely supportive of a single woman taking such colossal financial gambles. We built a lovely sandbox for you to play in, Alina, but recess is over. The adults must take over the heavy lifting. Play businesswoman." The phrase hung suspended in the air, mixing with the scent of the roasted turkey like a toxic cloud. I had single-handedly negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with North America's largest retail titans. I had orchestrated complex global shipping routes that saved the enterprise millions in operating costs. I had kept the payroll funded during a catastrophic global supply chain meltdown, all while Cameron was busy incinerating tens of thousands of dollars on fraudulent cryptocurrency schemes. Yet my own mother had just reduced a decade of my blood and sweat to a little girl playing in a sandbox. Simone smirked, thoroughly relishing the complete assassination of my character. She reached out and laced her manicured fingers through Cameron's. "We are going to take exquisite care of your little side project, Alina," she cooed. "You won't need to stress your pretty head over supply chains and vendor negotiations anymore. You can finally take a nap." Cameron leaned back, draping his arm over his chair, looking like a cheap imitation of a king. "So, what's your decision?" he demanded, his tone turning hostile. "Are you giving me the keys right now so you can walk away with your pride? Or are we going to have a massive public spectacle on Monday morning? Because I assure you, I have zero issues having my security team march you out to the parking lot holding a cardboard box in front of your former staff." The arrogance radiating through the room was so dense it could have been sliced with a carving knife. They truly believed they had me completely trapped. They thought they had outplayed the workhorse. They assumed they had seized the 51% control and legally stripped me of my own empire. Or so they desperately prayed. I refused to break eye contact with my egotistical brother. I reached down, retrieved my white linen napkin, and gently dabbed my lips again, ensuring the edges were perfectly aligned on the table. I picked up my crystal glass, holding it delicately by the stem, and took a prolonged, luxurious sip. The Merlot was deep, robust, and tasted remarkably like absolute victory. I placed the glass down onto the coaster. Moving with glacial slowness, I shifted my gaze away from Cameron, past Simone, past my mother, and locked my eyes directly onto my father. The architect of this entire corporate betrayal, who firmly believed I was too oblivious to see the knife coming. I allowed the silence to stretch for 5 agonizing, unbroken seconds. I watched the smug contentment slowly begin to leak out of his wrinkled face as it dawned on him that I wasn't weeping. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't dropping to my knees to beg for my livelihood. I leaned forward, planting my elbows on the polished mahogany, and tilted my head. "Should I break the news to them now?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm and razor-sharp. "Or do you want to?" The entire dining room instantly flatlined into dead silence. My father let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed loudly against the vaulted ceiling. He shook his head, leaning back and crossing his thick arms over his chest. He glared at me like I was a petulant toddler throwing a fit in a retail store. He didn't look threatened in the slightest. He genuinely thought I was just a desperate woman attempting to salvage her pride before being unceremoniously tossed into the gutter. "There's absolutely nothing to break to them, Alina," my father boomed in the deep, intimidating voice he used to dominate boardrooms. "You can try to spin this narrative however you please, but the legal reality is sitting right there in black and white. The documentation is entirely ironclad. I had my personal legal counsel draft and review every single line. You are out. Cameron is in. That is the end of the discussion, so accept your new reality." He leaned forward, planting his heavy forearms onto the table, locking onto my eyes. "Let me refresh your memory on how this enterprise actually began. 5 years ago, you came weeping to me because the bank flat-out rejected your commercial lease application for that initial warehouse. You lacked credit history and tangible assets. You were dead in the water. I am the one who intervened. I co-signed that initial $50,000 loan to launch your little project." My mother nodded, sipping her wine. "We rescued you from total financial devastation before you even launched," she added, trying to be helpful. My father aimed a thick, calloused finger right at my face. "Precisely. And in exchange for absorbing that massive financial liability, I ensured my name was written onto the foundational operating agreement of Omni Flow Logistics, LLC. I legally secured a 51% controlling stake from day one. I allowed you to handle the day-to-day grunt work. But make absolutely no mistake, Alina. I have always been the majority shareholder, and I possess the absolute legal authority to gift my shares to my son." He spoke with such blind, unshakable certainty. He honestly believed that a $50,000 bank signature from half a decade ago entitled him to hijack an empire currently valued in the millions. He conveniently omitted the fact that I had reimbursed every single cent of that loan within the first 24 months. He ignored the exorbitant interest rates I paid. He ignored the reality that I was the one pulling 90-hour weeks, sleeping on a rigid cot inside a freezing, unheated industrial warehouse. In his mind, his mere signature on a piece of paper outweighed my literal blood, sweat, and tears. Cameron smiled a wide, ravenous smile that exposed all of his pristine white teeth. He reached out, planting his palm flat against the legal transfer papers near the gravy boat. Slowly, he slid the heavy stack of documents across the polished table until it came to a halt right beside my dinner plate. "Read it and weep, sis," Cameron mocked, tapping the top sheet with his index finger. "The State Commerce Department has already processed the transfer. It is a legally binding done deal. You have zero ground to stand on. If you attempt to drag this into a courtroom, my attorneys will financially bleed you until you can't even afford a loaf of bread. Take your little severance check, pack up your desk plants, and vanish. Do not ruin this holiday for the rest of us." Simone chimed in, inspecting her flawless manicure with a deeply bored expression. "You really ought to listen to them, Alina. It is genuinely pathetic watching you attempt to act intimidating. You are a solitary woman with absolutely zero leverage. Cameron is the undeniable future of this family. Just sign the handover documents and let us finish this gorgeous Thanksgiving feast in peace. I am absolutely famished, and this hostile energy is dreadful for my baby." I glanced down at the documents, perfectly parallel with my dinner plate. The official state seal was proudly stamped on the cover page. The signatures of my father and brother were deeply etched at the bottom in thick blue ink. They had executed the transfer flawlessly, strictly adhering to the letter of the law regarding limited liability companies. They truly believed they had locked me inside a flawless legal cage. They thought they had outsmarted me using the exact corporate framework I had established to protect myself. I didn't touch the paperwork. I barely looked at it for more than 3 seconds. I simply maintained eye contact with my father, who was currently slicing a piece of turkey, looking immensely satisfied with his masterful coup. He had absolutely zero clue what was hurtling toward him. Moving with deliberate grace, I reached down beside my chair and hoisted up my leather designer tote bag. I unzipped the main compartment and extracted my digital tablet. The pristine glass screen reflected the ambient lig of the vintage chandelier. I didn't rush the process. I took my time wiping a microscopic smudge off the display before punching in my security passcode. I tapped the mail application and scrolled through my sent folder until I located a highly specific message. It was a company-wide corporate memo I had deployed exactly 3 weeks prior. I laid the tablet flat onto the table, right beside the towering stack of transfer documents Cameron had just pushed in my face. I rotated the device so the screen perfectly faced my brother. "Read it," I instructed softly. Cameron rolled his eyes, letting out a highly exaggerated sigh as if I were squandering his incredibly precious time. He peered down at the illuminated screen. Simone leaned over his shoulder, her diamond earrings swaying as she squinted to read the text. My father stopped chewing and frowned, visibly irritated that his flawless victory lap was being interrupted by a piece of technology. Cameron began reading the memo aloud. His tone started off bored, but rapidly escalated into extreme amusement. To the entire staff of OmniFlow Logistics LLC, please be advised that effective immediately, I will no longer be operating in the capacity of Chief Executive Officer for this specific limited liability company. I will be transitioning to an alternative role and stepping entirely away from the daily operations of this LLC. Thank you for your continued dedication. Cameron abruptly stopped reading and erupted into a booming, obnoxious laugh. He threw his head back, laughing so intensely his face flushed a light shade of red. Simone joined in, a massive, genuine grin spreading across her contoured features. Even Arthur chuckled, dabbing his mouth with a napkin, looking supremely victorious. "Are you honestly serious right now?" Cameron gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "You sent this out 3 weeks ago. You already quit." My mother clasped her hands together, looking absolutely thrilled. "Oh, Alina, that is magnificent news. See, Arthur. I told you she would eventually come to her senses. She knew she was drowning in responsibilities. She knew you were stepping in to fix the situation, so she simply bowed out gracefully. That demonstrates a great deal of maturity, darling. I am actually quite proud of you for acknowledging your own limitations." Cameron was still chuckling, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "I cannot fathom that you tried to sit here and play the stoic victim. You knew this was happening. You probably caught Dad's lawyers sniffing around and realized he was making his move. So you tucked your tail and sent a pathetic resignation memo to the staff before we could officially fire you. You just wanted to save face in front of the warehouse crew." Simone leaned back in her chair, gazing at me with pure, unadulterated pity. "This is honestly for the best, Alina. Truly. Now you don't have to endure the humiliation of being escorted off the premises by armed security. You quietly step down. That is exactly what an intelligent woman who knows she is defeated would do. You surrendered." My father aimed his fork at me. "This makes the executive transition significantly smoother," he declared in his booming, authoritative voice. "Tomorrow morning, Cameron can simply stroll in and claim the corner office. No dramatic fuss. You made the correct choice for once in your life, Alina. You stepped aside for the greater good of the family." I let them have their grand moment. I allowed them to bathe in their manufactured victory. I let them savor the sweet, intoxicating taste of what they firmly believed was my ultimate surrender. It is an exceedingly rare and beautiful phenomenon to watch deeply arrogant people construct an entire reality based on a fundamental misinterpretation of the facts. They assumed my email was a white flag. They assumed I had abandoned the fortress because I spotted their pathetic little army marching over the horizon. I reached out, gently pulling the tablet back toward me, and powered off the display. The dining room plunged into silence once more as they eagerly waited for me to verbally concede defeat and beg for my tiny severance check. They were waiting for the tears. They were waiting for the apology. I planted my hands firmly on the table and stared directly into Cameron's eyes. "I didn't resign," I stated, my voice echoing clear and steady, slicing through the thick tension. "I simply relocated my assets." Cameron's arrogant smile faltered for a microscopic fraction of a second. A brief flicker of deep confusion washed over his face. "What exactly are you talking about?" he demanded, his tone instantly defensive. "You just showed me the corporate memo." "You resigned as the CEO of OmniFlow Logistics LLC. You legally admitted it right there in writing to your entire staff." "Yes, I absolutely did," I replied with chilling calmness. but you clearly have no comprehension of what that actually entails for why. Our immediate financial future. I watched Cameron stare at me with a hollow, blank expression. He had squandered his entire adult life chasing get-rich-quick internet schemes and digital coins, but he knew absolutely zero about legitimate corporate law or how massive enterprises were actually structured. My father was equally illiterate in this highly specific domain. He assumed owning 51% of a legal document instantly transformed him into an untouchable business mogul. They both fundamentally underestimated just how much I had absorbed over the last decade of swimming with actual corporate predators in the real world. "Let me offer you a complimentary business seminar, Cameron," I said, keeping my tone conversational and low. "A limited liability company is essentially just an empty legal container. It holds whatever assets and liabilities you specifically choose to place inside it. When I launched OmniFlow Logistics 5 years ago, I placed everything inside that specific container. The commercial warehouse lease, the heavy equipment, the massive payroll, and eventually, the multi-million-dollar vendor contracts. That is the exact container our father co-signed the original $50,000 loan for. That is the container he legally possessed a 51% stake in. And that is the very container you just proudly transferred into your own name this morning." Cameron scoffed loudly, crossing his arms tightly over his overpriced jacket. "Right, the exact container that generates $15 million a year in gross revenue. Thank you for the basic recap, Professor. Are you finished stalling now, or do you have more to share?" I smiled, a warm, entirely relaxed smile. "Not anymore, Cameron. 6 months ago, I recognized that my proprietary supply chain software, the actual custom code that makes OmniFlow so incredibly lucrative, was legally exposed. I also noticed that our father was suddenly spending an unusual amount of time hounding my accounting department for long-term financial projections. I saw this exact hostile family coup coming from a mile away. So I retained a premier corporate law firm in Chicago to totally restructure my entire operation from the foundation up. I didn't just resign from OmniFlow Logistics LLC. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I legally incorporated a brand new entity, a Delaware C corporation named OmniFlow Worldwide. And over the course of the last 6 months, I have been methodically hollowing out the old container. I legally transferred all of the intellectual property, including the custom routing algorithms I personally coded from scratch, directly over to the new Delaware corporation. Since I was the sole original creator, and the archaic operating agreement never explicitly claimed ownership of my independent software code, that transfer was 100% legal and entirely airtight. My father dropped his silver fork. It struck his fine porcelain plate with a sharp, deafening clatter. "What exactly are you saying to us, Alina?" he demanded, his voice abruptly stripped of its booming, patriarchal bravado. "I am telling you that my new Delaware corporation completely owns the technology," I replied, keeping my tone dangerously light. But I certainly didn't stop there. Every single one of my major vendor contracts, including the massive distribution accounts with Atlas Retail and Sephora, conveniently expired at the close of the 3rd quarter. I simply opted not to renew them under the old limited liability company. Instead, I aggressively renegotiated and signed brand new multi-year contracts under OmniFlow Worldwide. My new corporation. The one I own 100% of. The one your expensive attorneys have absolutely zero legal claim to. The dining room became so terrifyingly quiet that you could hear the bitter autumn wind rustling the dead leaves outside the frosted windows. Simone slowly lowered her wine glass to the table, her hand visibly trembling. She was a luxury real estate broker. She understood the intricacies of contracts. She understood massive asset transfers. She was the very first person at the table to fully comprehend the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of what I had just orchestrated against her husband. Cameron stared down at the thick stack of legal transfer documents resting proudly beside the gravy boat. He glared at the official state seal. The magical piece of paper he genuinely believed had made him a millionaire executive. His face rapidly began to lose its color, morphing into a sickly, pale shade of gray. "You didn't hijack a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, Cameron," I said softly, leaning forward so he could absorb every single syllable. "You stole an empty shell, The company you just claimed majority ownership of does not own the operating software. It does not own the corporate branding. And as of yesterday evening, it possesses exactly 0 active clients. There is no revenue coming in on Monday morning. There is absolutely no revenue owing in next month. You just proudly assumed control of a completely hollowed-out corporate husk. Cameron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically against his silk tie. He glanced over at our father, who was suddenly fiercely fascinated by the intricate wood grain of the mahogany table. But Cameron's ego had always been his ultimate blind spot. He wasn't ready to wave the white flag just yet. He puffed out his chest and aimed an accusing finger directly at me across the feast. "You are completely lying," he stammered, desperately struggling to project authority. "You cannot simply take the massive clients and run away. Besides, the limited liability company still holds massive physical assets. I have personally visited the industrial park, Alina. I have walked the floor of that 50,000 square foot facility. I know we own the entire fleet of commercial delivery trucks. I know we own the massive automated sorting machinery on the warehouse floor. You can't stuff a heavy forklift into a new corporate filing. Those physical assets belong to the company I now legally control. You are just attempting to intimidate me into handing it back." I smiled slowly, easing back into my dining chair. I crossed my legs and regarded him with genuine, icy amusement. "You are entirely correct, Cameron," I said, ensuring my voice remained flawlessly even. "The limited liability company you now officially control still holds every single one of those physical assets. You own the exclusive right to operate the facility. You own the right to dispatch the delivery trucks. You own the incredibly expensive sorting machines." Cameron released a massive, dramatic exhale of relief, shooting Simone a triumphant, desperate grin. "See," he told his wife. "She is just running a bluff. We still possess the entire infrastructure. We can easily hire an aggressive new sales department and sign fresh, lucrative clients by the end of the month. We have the solid foundation." Simone did not return his smile. She remained entirely fixated on me, bracing herself for the other shoe to drop. As a high-end broker, she knew precisely how commercial leases functioned. She knew I was nowhere near finished. "Yes, you absolutely possess the infrastructure," I agreed, reaching deep into my heavy leather tote bag for the second time. "But you see, Cameron, physical assets in a massive logistics operation do not just exist in a vacuum. They come securely attached to corresponding, massive financial obligations." I retrieved a thick, heavy manila folder. It was practically bursting at the seams with official-looking documents heavily stamped with urgent red ink. I tossed it casually onto the center of the table, right on top of his precious corporate transfer papers. It landed with a loud, heavy thud that caused my mother to physically flinch. "Go right ahead," I offered, gesturing toward the overstuffed folder. "Open it. Take a good, long look at your shiny new empire." Cameron hesitated. His manicured hand hovered over the folder for several agonizing seconds before he finally flipped the heavy cardboard cover open. The very first page was a final legal warning from the massive commercial real estate conglomerate that owned the warehouse property. "That 50,000 square foot facility you just mentioned," I said casually, taking another sip of my dark red wine. "It is not owned by the company. It is leased. And that exorbitant commercial lease is up for its mandatory renewal on the 1st of next month. Because the old company just lost every single one of its major clients, the corporate landlord is aggressively demanding a massive security deposit just to renew the contract." Cameron flipped frantically to the next page, his hands physically beginning to vibrate. "And those automated sorting machines you were just boasting about," I continued, my voice ringing clear through the dead silent room. "They require mandatory annual maintenance and strict software licensing fees, which are entirely due next week. Factor in the massive fleet vehicle insurance premiums, the comprehensive commercial liability coverage, and the deferred state business taxes from the previous quarter." My father finally broke his silence, his voice incredibly tight and strained. "How much, Alina? Exactly how much is owed?" I stared right at my father and delivered the exact, brutal mathematics. $1.2 million, and every single penny of it is due within the next 14 days. The color entirely drained from Cameron's face, leaving him looking physically nauseous. He stared blankly at the towering stack of invoices, tax forms, and commercial lease renewals. $1.2 million, he whispered, his voice cracking horribly. The company does not have that kind of liquid cash lying around. I nodded slowly, in total agreement. You are absolutely correct. The old company bank account holds exactly $400. I legally transferred all the operating capital to my new Delaware corporation to quietly service my new vendor contracts, which leaves your new limited liability company entirely insolvent. Cameron snapped his head up, pure, unadulterated panic swimming in his eyes. We will just file for bankruptcy then. We will dissolve the entire company tomorrow morning. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and flashed him a terrifying, predatory smile. You cannot do that, Cameron. Did you even bother to read the fine print of the transfer documents you proudly signed this morning? When you eagerly accepted the 51% controlling interest and enthusiastically named yourself the chief executive officer, you also legally accepted the role of primary personal guarantor for all corporate debts. The dining room was dead silent. Even my mother completely stopped breathing. That means the furious commercial creditors will not just go after the empty company shell, I explained, watching his perfect universe completely implode. They are going to aggressively come after you, personally. They will seize your personal bank accounts. They will seize your luxury vehicles. They will go after anything of immense value you currently hold. You didn't just steal my company, Cameron. You volunteered to take my garbage to the landfill, and you signed an ironclad contract stating you would personally pay for the absolute privilege. Simone didn't utter a single syllable at first. She sat entirely frozen in her expensive chair, glaring at the mountain of invoices and legal notices I had dropped onto the table. Her eyes darted rapidly between the staggering numbers printed in bold red ink and the completely terrified face of her husband. As a luxury real estate broker, Simone navigated commercial contracts, strict zoning laws, and complex financial liabilities every single day. She knew how to decode the fine print better than anyone else in the room. She knew a death sentence when she saw one. Suddenly, Simone lunged violently across the table. Her manicured hand snatched the thick stack of transfer documents right out from under Cameron's trembling fingers. She yanked the paperwork toward her and began flipping frantically through the dense pages of the operating agreement that our father had paid his expensive lawyers to draft. Her eyes scanned the legal paragraphs with brutal, terrifying efficiency, hunting for the specific clauses governing the assumption of corporate debt. Cameron attempted to pull the papers back. "Simone," he stammered, his voice weak and pathetic. "Stop it. You don't need to look at those. We just need to figure out a new strategy." Simone forcefully swatted his hand away. "Shut your mouth, Cameron," she hissed, her voice dripping with lethal venom. "Do not utter another word until I finish reading this." My mother shifted uncomfortably, glancing back and forth between her golden boy and his deeply furious wife. "Simone, dear, please lower your voice," Margaret pleaded, desperately attempting to maintain her fragile illusion of control. "Arthur will contact his legal team on Monday, and we will get this all sorted out." "Alina is just trying to intimidate us." Simone ignored my mother entirely. She reached the 4th page of the transfer agreement, and her manicured finger stopped dead on a highly specific paragraph. Her face turned an ashen shade of gray. She slowly lifted her head and stared directly at my father. Her eyes were wide with a horrifying mixture of absolute disbelief and raw, mounting fury. "You absolute idiot," Simone whispered, staring at my father like he was a complete stranger. "You let him sign a full assumption of liability clause. You transferred the majority ownership without conducting a single independent audit of the corporate accounts. You handed your own son a financial live grenade and convinced him it was a gold mine." My father puffed out his chest, desperately trying to regain his dominance. "I secured the family legacy," he barked defensively. "The infrastructure alone is worth millions. We will simply restructure the debt. It is standard business practice." "Simone, you are wildly overreacting." Simone let out a dark, bitter, chilling laugh. "Restructure the debt," she repeated, her voice rising in pitch. "Arthur, you cannot restructure a commercial lease default when the new primary guarantor has a credit score hovering around 600 because of failed crypto investments. I read these specific clauses every single day. The corporate landlord strictly required a personal guarantee for the facility lease. When Alina stepped down and Cameron took over, that personal guarantee instantly transferred to him. She violently slammed the paperwork onto the mahogany table, pointing an accusing finger directly at her husband. Cameron didn't just inherit a logistics company, she yelled, her professional composure entirely shattering. He legally assumed every single penny of its outstanding debt. He is now personally on the hook for the warehouse lease, the heave, Y equipment renewals, and the deferred back taxes. They possess a legally binding document that says Cameron will pay them directly out of his own pocket. Cameron looked physically ill. He gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning entirely white. "But I don't have $1.2 million, he choked out, looking wildly around the room. "I don't have any liquid cash, Mom. You know I don't have that kind of money." Simone stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She looked down at Cameron with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. A sickening silence fell over the room as the reality of her next words prepared to totally obliterate their marriage. "You do not have liquid cash, Cameron," Simone said, her voice dangerously low and trembling with rage. "But you do have assets, or at least, you used to." I watched the entire chaotic scene unfold with immense, quiet satisfaction, taking another very slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and the financial ruin was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a physical weight pressing down on their chests, suffocating them in real time. Simone knew exactly what those angry commercial creditors would aggressively come after first. She knew because she was the exact person who had helped Cameron secure it. And judging by the terrible look of absolute terror creeping onto Cameron's pale face, he suddenly realized exactly what she was about to reveal. Simone turned her entire body to confront her husband. The sheer panic in Cameron's eyes was no longer just about the massive corporate debt I had laid out on the table. It was about something much deeper and far more personal. He reached out, grabbing her wrist in a desperate attempt to silence her. "Please, Simone," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Don't say it. We can fix this. Please don't do this right now." She yanked her arm out of his grasp with such violent force that her crystal wine glass rattled heavily against the polished wood. "Do not touch me," she hissed, her voice vibrating with terrifying, restrained fury. "You told me this was a sure thing, Cameron. You looked me dead in the eyes and promised me that your father was handing you the keys to an absolute gold mine." My parents sat perfectly still. My mother looked down at her lap, suddenly unable to meet anyone's gaze. My father cleared his throat loudly, shifting his considerable weight in his expensive chair. I watched the dynamic shift in the room with absolute fascination. The united front they had so proudly displayed just 20 minutes ago was rapidly fracturing into a million jagged pieces. Simone stood up straight, towering over Cameron, who was now physically shrinking into his seat. "Tell her what you did, Cameron," Simone demanded, her voice rising to a dangerous pitch. "Tell your brilliant sister exactly how you managed to convince your father to hand over the majority ownership today, because we both know Arthur does not just give things away for free." Cameron squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head miserably. He was entirely defeated. "Since my husband is suddenly incapable of speaking, I will tell you, Alina," Simone said, turning her burning gaze toward me. "Weeks ago, Cameron came to me with this brilliant master plan. He said your father was finally ready to push you out, but Arthur wanted extreme financial security for his retirement. Cameron convinced me that if we bought out your parents' original equity stake, they would sign over the controlling interest immediately. He said it was the investment opportunity of a lifetime." I slowly set my wine glass down. A brand new layer of this twisted family betrayal was unfolding right before my eyes. "You bought them out?" I asked, raising a single eyebrow. "With what money, Simone? Cameron does not possess a trust fund, and he has never held a steady job for more than 6 months. Simone let out a harsh, bitter sob that sounded exactly like a piece of glass breaking. "We used our house," she cried out, her professional composure completely breaking down. "Cameron convinced me to take out a $300,000 second mortgage on our home. I'm a real estate broker, Alina. My entire career relies strictly on my credit and my property investments, but I trusted my husband. We leveraged our beautiful house, and we gave all of that cash directly to your father." My father suddenly looked incredibly uncomfortable. He reached for his water glass, actively avoiding my eyes. "It was a standard buyout agreement," he mumbled defensively. "Cameron wanted skin in the game. I needed to know he was entirely serious about taking over the family legacy. It was a perfectly legitimate business transaction." "Legitimate business transaction?" Simone screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceiling of the dining room. You took $300,000 from your own son to hand him a bankrupt shell of a company. You let us mortgage our entire future tea. Oh, by a mountain of commercial debt. You knew Alina was making moves. You had to have known something was wrong. But you just wanted to cash out before the ship sank, and you let your own son go down with it. The horrific reality of the situation washed over the table. Cameron had not just accepted a toxic asset. He had paid a massive, life-ruining premium for it. And my parents, who loved to endlessly preach about family loyalty and legacy, had eagerly accepted that money, knowing full well they were completely screwing over their favorite child just to line their own retirement accounts. If those creditors call in the debts on Monday morning, Simone continued, her voice trembling violently, they are going to come directly after the new majority shareholder. They are going to see the massive equity in our home. They are going to place a severe lien on my property. You didn't just ruin your own life, Cameron. You destroyed my business, my credit, and my home all in one single afternoon. This was supposed to be our secure future. Now it is a massive financial nightmare that will definitively haunt us forever. You absolutely disgust me. I'm entirely done. Simone stood there, her chest heaving as she glared at the man she married. The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. My mother let out a sharp gasp, pressing her hands against her cheeks. She looked at my father, fully expecting him to somehow magically fix this massive disaster. But my father was no longer sitting back in his chair with that smug, patriarchal smile. The reality of Simone and her furious threat had completely shattered his illusion of absolute control. Arthur realized in that exact moment that the $300,000 he had quietly squeezed from his own son was entirely tied to a worthless, debt-ridden shell. He knew that if Simone filed for divorce and the commercial creditors came knocking, that money he took for his retirement would be dragged straight into a brutal, highly public legal battle. A bankruptcy court would claw that money right back out of his personal bank accounts. His perfect retirement plan was suddenly a massive legal liability. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple. He slammed his heavy fists onto the mahogany table, causing the fine china and the crystal wine glasses to rattle violently. He stood up, towering over the table, his chest heaving with uncontrolled anger. He did not yell at Cameron or Simone. Instead, he turned his burning rage entirely toward me. "You did this on purpose," Arthur roared, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at my face. "You planned this entire thing. You deliberately stripped the company of its most valuable assets to leave your brother holding the bag. You set us all up." I looked up at him, completely unbothered. I took a slow bite of my dinner, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "I simply protected my own intellectual property and my own vendor relationships," I replied, keeping my voice calm and even. "You are the one who decided to secretly buy me out without doing a single shred of due diligence. You are the one who let your son leverage his home to buy a hollowed-out company. I didn't set you up, Arthur. Your own overwhelming greed set you up." My father was breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, desperately searching for a way out of a trap. "You are not going to get away with this, Alina," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you are so incredibly smart with your new Delaware corporation and your sneaky little asset transfers. But you forgot exactly who you are dealing with. I have the absolute best corporate lawyers in the state on my payroll." He leaned across the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, just like he had done my entire childhood. "I am going to aggressively sue you for breach of fiduciary duty," he threatened, his voice booming through the dining room. As the former chief executive officer of the limited liability company, you had a strict legal obligation to act in the best financial interest of that business. Transferring all the assets and lucrative client contracts to a competing firm that you personally own is a textbook violation of the law. I will have my lawyers file an emergency injunction on Monday morning. We will freeze every single bank account your new corporation holds. We will drag you through court until you are completely bankrupt and begging for mercy." My mother nodded aggressively, her face twisted in anger. "Your father will absolutely do it, Alina," she spat. "You have crossed a massive line today. You do not just steal from your own family and walk away smiling. We will take everything back." Cameron looked up, a small glimmer of desperate hope returning to his pale face. He looked at our father like a drowning man looking at a life raft. "Yes," Cameron croaked, his voice weak. "We will take it to court. We will absolutely prove yo." You illegally embezzled the company assets. I sat there listening to their desperate, pathetic threats. They honestly believed they still held a winning card. They thought they could use the legal system to bully me back into submission. They thought my months of meticulous planning could be undone by a simple temper tantrum and a threat of heavy litigation. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. And then I looked at my brother. And I began to laugh. I didn't just chuckle. I threw my head back and let out a genuine, loud, ringing laugh that echoed off the dining room walls. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent 10 years walking on eggshells, suddenly realizing she was completely, utterly invincible. My laughter seemed to shock them significantly more than the financial ruin itself. Arthur stopped yelling. Margaret stared at me like I had lost my mind. Cameron shrank back into his chair. You think you can sue me for breach of fiduciary duty? I asked, wiping a genuine tear of amusement from my eye. I reached back into my heavy leather tote bag. Oh, Arthur, you really should pay closer attention to your own email inbox. I pulled out a single, crisp piece of paper and placed it firmly on the table. It was a printed copy of a digital contract. I slid it across the smooth mahogany wood until it rested directly next to his precious transfer papers. I watched my father look down at it. His eyes darted across the bold legal heading at the top of the page. The deep purple anger in his face slowly began to curdle into pure confusion. Do you remember 2 months ago, Arthur? I asked, keeping my voice conversational, like we were simply discussing the weather. I bought you that all-expenses-paid luxury golf trip to Cabo San Lucas. I flew you out first class. I booked you the presidential suite at the resort. I even paid for your unlimited bar tab at the clubhouse. My father stared at me. He didn't say a single word. His thick hands remained frozen on the armrests of his chair. You never even thanked me for that trip, I continued, resting my chin on my folded hands. You just assumed it was your absolute right as the patriarch to reap the lavish benefits of my hard work. You spent 5 days down there living like an absolute king on the corporate credit card, while I was back here managing a massive supply chain crisis. You even bragged to your country club friends that you were the true mastermind behind OmniFlow and that you deserved the vacation. I paused, letting the silence stretch. But I didn't send you to Mexico because I felt generous. I sent you there because I needed you deeply distracted. Simone let out a sharp breath, her eyes widening as she realized exactly where this was going. As a broker, she dealt with digital contracts daily. She knew exactly how easily arrogant, wealthy men ignored the fine print when they felt invincible. On the 3rd day of your trip, you were playing the 14th hole overlooking the ocean, I said, perfectly recalling the timeline. You were at least 4 margaritas deep. I know this because you posted a very blurry picture of your cocktail on your social media account. And right at that exact moment, I sent you an email. The subject line simply stated it was a routine administrative update for our annual tax filings. My father reached out with a trembling hand and slowly picked up the piece of paper. You didn't want to stop playing golf to read a boring legal document, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady hum. You just wanted to clear the annoying notification off your phone so you could get back to your game. So you opened the DocuSign link, you scrolled rapidly to the very bottom, and you used your thumb to digitally sign your name. You didn't read a single paragraph, but the software logged your exact internet protocol address, your geographic location in Cabo, and the precise second you legally bound yourself to those terms. Arthur was completely silent. His eyes were scanning the text on the page, moving frantically back and forth like a trapped animal looking for a way out. Read the second paragraph out loud for the table, Arthur, I instructed, leaning back in my dining chair. He didn't speak. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter right there in his mouth. Fine, I will read it for you, I said, reciting the legal clause from memory. The majority shareholder hereby explicitly authorizes the unrestricted transfer of all intellectual property, custom software architecture, and existing vendor contracts from OmniFlow Logistics to OmniFlow Worldwide. Furthermore, the majority shareholder permanently waives any right to contest this transfer, litigate against the founder, or claim breach of fiduciary duty in any future legal proceedings. My mother gasped loudly, clutching the pearls at her neck. Arthur, she whispered, her voice filled with absolute terror. Tell me you didn't sign that. Tell me she is lying to us. My father slowly lowered the piece of paper. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had just violently threatened to destroy my life was completely gone. He looked like a deflated balloon. The document in his hand was an ironclad, legally binding waiver. His own expensive corporate lawyers would take one single look at that digital signature and tell him he had absolutely no case. He had voluntarily surrendered his only weapon. "You gave me the keys to the castle while you were getting drunk on a golf course," I said, a cold, hard smile spreading across my face. "You explicitly approved the entire asset transfer. You legally signed away your right to sue me. There will be no emergency injunction on Monday morning. There will be no massive lawsuit. You have absolutely no legal recourse. I made sure my legal team bulletproofed that waiver specifically for this exact moment." Cameron looked like he was about to be physically sick. He turned to our father, his eyes wide with desperate, pathetic pleading. "Dad," he choked out, his voice shaking. "Tell me we can fight this. Tell me you have a plan to fix this." But Arthur had nothing. He had spent his entire life treating me like a naive little girl who existed only to serve his grand vision. He never respected my intellect, and that fatal flaw had just cost him everything. He just stared blankly at the printed certificate resting on the table, realizing he had walked directly into his own slaughterhouse. He thought he was playing a master game of corporate chess, but he hadn't even realized we were on an entirely different board. Cameron refused to accept the horrifying reality of the situation unfolding before him. He reached up and aggressively loosened his expensive silk tie, pulling at his tight collar. He was sweating profusely, heavy drops of moisture gathering on his pale forehead. His terrified eyes darted wildly around the formal dining room, desperately searching for a magical escape hatch from the absolute financial nightmare he had just willingly signed up for. He looked over at our father, who was still staring blankly at the signed legal waiver in total defeat. He looked across the table at Simone, who actively glared back at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. "This is a massive, elaborate bluff," Cameron suddenly shouted, his voice shrill and entirely panicked. "You cannot just illegally steal the valuable client roster like that. They exclusively signed up with OmniFlow Logistics. They completely trust the established brand name and the massive physical infrastructure. You honestly think you can just magically make the biggest retail clients in the entire country disappear into thin air? I am directly calling Marcus right now to completely prove you wrong in front of everyone." Marcus was the vice president of regional supply chain for Atlas Retail. He was our largest single corporate account, directly responsible for nearly 40% of our annual gross revenue. It was a massive multi-million-dollar contract I had personally secured. Cameron quickly shoved his trembling right hand deep into his tailored suit pocket and violently pulled out his heavy smartphone. He frantically scrolled through his long list of business contacts until he finally found the correct corporate directory number. He forcefully tapped the glowing glass screen and immediately hit the loud speakerphone button so the entire family could clearly hear his impending triumph. He angrily slammed the phone down right next to his half-eaten dinner plate. The line began to ring. The sound echoed loudly in the silent room. My mother leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together in a silent prayer. Simone crossed her arms, completely unconvinced. I picked up my silver fork and took another bite of my sweet potato casserole, enjoying the live entertainment. The line clicked. "This is Marcus," a professional voice said. "Marcus, my man," Cameron yelled, leaning over his phone, projecting absolute confidence. "It is Cameron. I am calling to introduce myself as the new majority shareholder and chief executive officer of OmniFlow Logistics. My father and I officially took over today. I wanted to personally assure you that your account will receive top-tier priority. We will aggressively scale our operations to serve you better." There was a very long, uncomfortable pause on the other end. The heavy silence stretched for so long that Cameron nervously tapped his knuckles against the table. "I am sorry," Marcus finally said, his tone utterly confused. "Who exactly is this?" Cameron's fake smile faltered. "It is Cameron," he repeated, losing his swagger. "Arthur is my father. Elena is my sister. I am the new chief executive officer of OmniFlow Logistics." Another heavy pause followed. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was icy. "Listen, Cameron, I have absolutely no idea who you are. Atlas Retail does not hold any active contracts with an entity called OmniFlow Logistics LLC. Cameron's fac. E turned a sickening shade of gray. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, a cold sweat breaking out. "We process millions of units for your retail stores every quarter." "We did have a commercial contract with that limited liability company," Marcus corrected him, growing visibly annoyed. "But that contract expired 30 days ago. We chose not to renew it. We recently signed a brand new, exclusive 5-year distribution agreement with a completely different corporate organization called Flow Worldwide. Alina is our sole point of contact and the only person my board completely trusts." Cameron opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a helpless fish. "I don't know what kind of messy family drama you have going on," Marcus continued, completely impatient. "But I highly suggest you stop calling my personal cell phone with these fraudulent claims. If you have further questions, contact our legal department on Monday. Have a good evening." The line went dead immediately. A sharp, piercing beep echoed through the dining room, signaling the end. Cameron stared blindly at the dark black screen of his phone. The tiny digital speaker had just ruthlessly delivered the final, fatal blow to his fragile ego. He had desperately tried to assert dominance over my successful logistics empire, and instead, he was brutally humiliated by the exact corporate client he foolishly thought he owned. He had absolutely nothing left in the world. He was a pathetic, fake executive sitting frozen at a holiday dinner table, holding the massive, suffocating legal debts of a completely worthless, ruined company. The heavy silence that followed the phone call was suddenly shattered by the sound of breaking glass. My mother had jumped up from her chair so violently that she knocked her crystal water goblet onto the floor. The expensive glass shattered into dozens of jagged pieces across the hardwood, but she didn't even look down. Margaret was staring at me with a look of pure, unhinged hatred. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly out of place, and her face was flushed with frantic maternal rage. She could not stand seeing her precious golden boy sitting there completely broken and humiliated. "You are a thief," my mother screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. Her voice was shrill and completely devoid of her usual country club elegance. "You are a disgusting, selfish thief, Alina. You manipulated your own father. You stole the family business right out from under us, and now you are trying to destroy your brother's life just because you are jealous of him. You have always been jealous of him. I will personally make sure you go to jail for this. We are going to call the police and tell them you embezzled millions of dollars from the family company." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my heavy leather tote bag for the third and final time. "Am I the embezzler, Mother?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Let us take a look at the actual accounting records before you decide to dial emergency services." I pulled out a thick, bright red folder and slapped it down onto the mahogany table. It landed right on top of the useless corporate transfer documents and the massive pile of commercial debt notices. "What is that?" my father demanded, his voice lacking all of its previous booming authority. He was staring at the red folder like it was a live, explosive device. "That, Arthur," I said, tapping the heavy cardboard cover, "is the complete, uncensored transaction history of the secondary corporate credit card for Flow Logistics. The specific card you secretly demanded I issue to Cameron 2 years ago so he could, quote, entertain potential vendors. You told me it was a necessary business expense to train him for an executive role. I strongly advised against it, but as the majority shareholder, you forced my hand." Cameron's head snapped up. The sickly gray color of his face instantly drained into a ghostly absolute white. He knew exactly what was inside that red folder. I opened the cover and pulled out the first page of the highlighted bank statements. I didn't even need to look at the numbers because I had memorized them months ago. "Would you like to hear how your brilliant son has been entertaining our vendors?" I asked, looking directly at my mother, who was still standing rigid by her chair. "Let us review his highly professional executive expenses. Last March, he charged $14,000 at a VIP nightclub in Miami. He expensed it as a client dinner. I checked our corporate logs, and we do not have a single vendor or client located within 500 miles of Miami." Simone whipped her head around to glare at Cameron. "Miami," she hissed, her voice lethal. "You told me you were at a logistics conference in Atlanta last March." I flipped to the next page. "In July, he initiated a direct corporate wire transfer of $35,000 to an offshore digital currency exchange. He categorized it in the accounting software as an international freight tariff. He used company money to buy unregulated crypto tokens, which completely collapsed in value 3 days later. That is $35,000 of operating capital gone instantly. Cameron buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled groan. And my absolute personal favorite, I continued, pulling out a glossy receipt from a luxury boutique last Christmas. He used the corporate card to purchase a $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet. He classified it as a year-end bonus for a top-tier warehouse manager. I looked directly at Simone. She was wearing a very nice watch, but she was definitely not wearing a $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet. She realized it at the exact same moment. Her eyes widened, and she looked at Cameron with a level of disgust that could melt solid steel. He had used company money to buy expensive jewelry for another woman while simultaneously begging his wife to take out a second mortgage on their family home. My father sat entirely frozen. Even he didn't know the full extent of Cameron's financial abuse. He had enabled his son, but he had never bothered to actually check the ledgers. "You want to sue me for breach of fiduciary duty, Arthur?" I asked, turning my attention back to the defeated patriarch. "You want to drag my new Delaware corporation into a lengthy legal discovery process? Go right ahead. File the paperwork on Monday morning. But the exact second your lawyers file that suit, I am taking this bright red folder and I am handing it directly to the Internal Revenue Service." My mother slowly sank back down into her chair, completely defeated. "The federal government does not play games with corporate tax fraud," I explained, my voice cold and absolute. "Commingling personal luxury, expenses with corporate accounts, and writing them off as tax deductions is a massive federal crime. If you sue me, the IRS audits the old limited liability company. They will immediately see that the new chief executive officer has been routinely embezzling thousands of dollars. Cameron will not just lose the company. He will not just lose his house. He will be sitting in a federal prison cell for wire fraud and tax evasion. So tell me, Arthur, do you still want to call your lawyers?" Arthur didn't answer me. He slowly lowered his eyes to the table, staring blankly at the polished wood. The great patriarch of the family, the man who had ruled our household with an iron fist for decades, had completely surrendered. He knew I had him perfectly cornered. If he tried to protect his own ego by fighting me in court, he would send his favorite son directly to a federal penitentiary. The illusion of our perfect, wealthy family finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there over the Thanksgiving turkey. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the heavy, ragged breathing coming from Cameron. He was staring at the glossy receipt for the diamond tennis bracelet like it was a venomous snake about to strike him. But the strike didn't come from the receipt. It came directly from his furious wife. Simone stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. She didn't even flinch at the noise. She stepped toward Cameron, her entire body vibrating with a terrifying, cold rage. "My family warned me about you," Simone said, her voice dangerously low and dangerously steady. "When I first brought you home to meet my parents in Atlanta, my father took one look at you and told me exactly what you were. My brothers told me you were nothing but a lazy, entitled little boy pretending to be a man. They saw right through your expensive tailored suits and your elite country club membership. They told me you completely lacked the fundamental work ethic to ever provide for a family." Cameron looked up at her, his eyes begging for mercy. "Simone, please," he whispered. "Let us just go home and talk about this in private. I can easily explain everything." "Explain what?" Simone shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Explain how you mortgaged our entire future for a bankrupt shell. Explain how you let your brilliant sister do all the hard work for 10 years while you played pretend executive. Or do you want to explain the $12,000 diamond bracelet you bought for someone else while I was paying our residential mortgage out of my own real estate commissions?" She grabbed her water glass from the table and threw the ice-cold liquid directly into his pale, sweating face. Cameron gasped, shrinking back into his chair as the water dripped down his nose and completely soaked his pristine white collar. "You are a complete fraud, Cameron," Simone spat, glaring down at him with absolute disgust. "You have absolutely nothing to offer a successful woman like me. I built my career from the ground up. I worked my entire life to secure my financial independence. And you manipulated me into handing it all over to your greedy father so you could finally feel like a big, important chief executive officer. You are entirely pathetic." My mother let out a small, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. She had never seen anyone speak to her precious golden boy this way, but she was too terrified of the Internal Revenue Service threat to actually intervene. Simone didn't even glance at my mother. Instead, she slowly turned her burning, furious gaze away from her humiliated husband and locked eyes with my father. Arthur was still staring down at the table, trying to make himself look as small as physically possible. "You listen to me, Arthur," Simone demanded, stepping closer to the head of the dining table. "I do not care about your fake corporate transfer documents. I do not care about your stupid legal threats against Alina, and I definitely do not care about this pathetic excuse for a son you raised. I only care about one thing right now." My father slowly looked up, his face pale and incredibly haggard. "I want my $300,000 back," Simone said, her voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You took that money from me knowing exactly what was happening. You knew this logistics company was unstable. You knew your daughter was the only one actually holding it together. But you eagerly took my hard-earned money anyway to pad your own luxury retirement account. We can discuss the complicated finances later, Simone," my father mumbled, trying to sound diplomatic but completely failing. "This is a family holiday. Let us all just calm down and look at the exact numbers on Monday morning." "We are not discussing anything later," Simone snapped, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated fury. "You are going to write me a certified check for $300,000 right now. If you do not wire that money back into my account by tomorrow morning, I will personally call the commercial landlord of that warehouse and tell them exactly what your son just did. I will call the bank that holds the corporate credit card and report the fraud myself. I will burn this entire fake family to the ground to get my house back. Do you understand me, Arthur?" My father stared at the furious woman standing at the end of his dining table. For a fleeting second, he looked like an old, defeated man. But then a very familiar shift happened. The narcissistic pride that had governed his entire life violently kicked back in. He was a man who demanded absolute respect, and he was not about to let his daughter-in-law scream at him in his own house. Arthur slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, puffing out his chest to regain his physical dominance in the room. He looked down his nose at Simone with an expression of cold, calculating arrogance. "I understand that you are highly emotional right now, Simone," my father said, his voice returning to that deep, booming register. "But you will not stand in my dining room and threaten me. You will not speak to me like I am some common criminal who stole your purse." "I want my money back," Simone repeated, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "It was not a request, Arthur. It was a demand." My father let out a short, dismissive scoff. He reached for his crystal water glass, taking a slow sip before answering her. "I am not giving you a single penny back," he stated plainly. The room seemed to plunge into an absolute freezing temperature. Cameron looked up with wide, terrified eyes. "Dad," he pleaded, "you have to give it back to her. We are going to lose our house." "Shut up, Cameron," my father snapped without even looking at him. He turned his attention back to Simone. "Let us be very clear about what happened here. Your husband approached me with a buyout offer. He wanted the controlling interest of a multi-million-dollar logistics infrastructure. He presented me with a contract. I signed the contract, and he wired the funds. It was a completely fair business transaction between two consenting adult men. It is not my fault that your husband is a complete financial idiot." Simone stepped back as if she had been physically struck. "You knew the company was deeply in debt," she said, her voice shaking. "You knew it was a hollow shell." My father shrugged his shoulders, his face entirely devoid of guilt or remorse. "I knew the commercial lease was coming up for renewal," he admitted casually. "I knew Alina was aggressively restructuring the vendor contracts, but in the corporate world, it is the absolute legal responsibility of the buyer to conduct extensive due diligence before acquiring a major asset." Cameron did absolutely zero research. He didn't hire an independent auditor. He didn't request the updated tax ledgers. He just blindly handed me a check because his massive ego convinced him he could run a company better than his sister. That is his own personal failure. I am not a charity, Simone. I am a retired businessman. That $300,000 is already securely locked away in an irrevocable retirement trust fund. You cannot touch it, and I am certainly not returning it just because you two made a terrible real estate gamble. I watched Simone process the sheer, absolute magnitude of his betrayal. She slowly turned her head and looked at my mother. Margaret was staring intently at her plate, completely refusing to make eye contact with the woman whose life they had just intentionally ruined. Margaret was entirely complicit. She was perfectly happy to sacrifice her son and his pregnant wife if it meant securing her own luxury retirement lifestyle. The illusion of the wealthy, respectable suburban family evaporated into thin air. Simone finally saw them exactly the way I had seen them for the last 20 years. They were parasites. They wore expensive clothes and lived in a beautiful, manicured home, but they fed on the hard work and financial stability of anyone they could sink their teeth into. First, they fed on me, and when I finally cut off their supply, they eagerly turned around and fed on their own golden boy. "You are monsters," Simone whispered, shaking her head in total disbelief. "Both of you. You raised a lazy, entitled fraud, and then you completely robbed him blind." She let out a dry, hollow laugh that held absolutely no humor. "I used to wonder why Alina always kept her distance from this family. I used to think she was just cold and difficult. But you people are a completely toxic infection. You actively destroy everything you touch." Simone slowly reached down and picked up her expensive designer handbag from the floor. She didn't look frantic anymore. She looked terrifyingly calm. "I am going to call my lawyers on Monday morning," she announced, her voice ringing clear and steady. "I am filing for an emergency divorce, and I am instructing my legal team to aggressively subpoena those retirement trust records. You might think you executed a brilliant corporate buyout, Arthur, but you knowingly committed financial fraud to extract equity from my personal property. I will drag this entire fake family through the absolute mud." My father couldn't even form a coherent response. He just stared at Simone as she clutched her designer handbag, standing there like a ticking time bomb. The sheer aggressive force of her threat completely paralyzed him. But while my father was retreating into a state of shocked silence, my mother suddenly realized that brute force and legal threats were absolutely useless against me. She realized they were completely out of ammunition. So, she instantly pivoted to the only weapon she had left in her entire arsenal: emotional manipulation. Margaret let out a loud, theatrical sob that echoed sharply in tea. The quiet dining room. Her shoulders began to violently shake, and she buried her face in her hands. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times before. Growing up, whenever my mother was losing an argument or getting caught in a lie, she would instantly transform herself into a helpless victim. She would cry until the other person felt so incredibly guilty they simply apologized just to make the tears stop. "Alina, please," she wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "Please look at what is happening to our family. We are completely falling apart right before my eyes on Thanksgiving." She pushed her chair back and slowly walked over to my side of the table. She reached out with her perfectly manicured hands and grabbed my forearm. Her grip was desperate and tight. I didn't pull away. I just sat there looking at the fake tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks. "You have made your point, Alina," my mother cried out, her voice dripping with desperation. "You proved that you are the smartest person in the room. You proved that your father underestimated you, and you proved that Cameron needs you. We completely admit it. You won. But please, you cannot let your own brother go to federal prison. You cannot let Simone lose her home. You have such a good heart, Alina. You have always been the sensible one." I stared at her, completely unmoved. Sensible was just the word she used when she wanted me to quietly absorb their toxic behavior without complaining. "You need to be the bigger person here," my mother begged, squeezing my arm tighter. "I know you are angry, but you have to forgive us. You can fix this. You can call your lawyers on Monday and merge your new corporation back into the original company. You can bring the massive client contracts back. If you do that, the commercial debt will be easily covered. We can pay Simone back her $300,000, and everything can just go back to normal." I slowly reached over and removed her hands from my arm. "Go back to normal," I repeated, my voice incredibly flat. "You mean go back to me working 90-hour weeks to fund Cameron's luxury lifestyle? You mean go back to me being the invisible workhorse while he gets paraded around the country club as the brilliant young executive?" My mother shook her head frantically, fresh tears spilling from her eyes. "No, Alina, it will be completely different now," she pleaded. "Your father and I will make sure Cameron respects you. We will make sure you get the proper credit, but you cannot just walk away and destroy him. You are breaking your mother's heart, Alina. I raised you to value family above money. How can you sit there drinking wine while your own flesh and blood faces complete financial ruin?" She took a deep breath, steadying herself before delivering what she thought was her ultimate emotional masterstroke. "You have to look at the bigger picture, Alina," she whispered, her voice thick with fake emotion. "You are 34 years old. You have no husband, you have no children. You chose your career over starting a family, and that is fine. But Cameron is having a baby. He is the one carrying on the family name. Cameron is your family legacy. You cannot punish an innocent, unborn child just because you are holding on to some petty resentment. You have to sacrifice this for the greater good of our family bloodline." Simone let out a sharp sound of pure disgust from the other end of the table. "Do not you dare use my unborn child as a pawn to save your worthless son, Margaret," she spat. "My baby is not a bargaining chip to get you out of federal tax fraud. If my child is his only legacy, then his legacy is entirely built on lies and stolen money. Do not speak for my child ever again." There it was. The absolute ugliest truth of my entire existence, laid bare on the Thanksgiving table. In my mother's eyes, my life had absolutely no inherent value because I was not providing an heir to the family name. My massive corporate success, my intelligence, my independence, none of it mattered. I was just a barren branch on the family tree, expected to kindly snap off and turn myself into firewood to keep my brother's house warm. Cameron looked up from his hands, his eyes red and puffy. "Please, Alina," he croaked out, sounding like a pathetic child. "I will do whatever you want. I will give you the title back. Just merge the companies, do it for the baby." I looked at the three of them. My father still paralyzed in his chair, my brother begging like a coward, my mother using her unborn grandchild as a human shield to protect her golden boy. They honestly thought the heavy weight of family guilt would finally break my spine. They thought I would surrender my entire empire just to prove I was a good daughter. They were so incredibly wrong. I pushed my chair back very slowly and stood up from the Thanksgiving table. The antique hardwood floor creaked softly beneath me. I looked down at my mother, whose face was still stye. Ned with those entirely manufactured tears. I looked at my father, who was still slouching in total defeat, his heavy shoulders sagging under the weight of his own monumental arrogance. And finally, I looked at my brother, who was staring up at me with the desperate, pathetic eyes of a completely broken man. "I am not angry, Mother," I began, my voice perfectly steady and resonant in the quiet room. "Anger requires a level of emotional investment that I simply no longer possess for any of you. What I feel right now is absolute, profound clarity." My mother opened her mouth to speak again, to launch into another pathetic wailing session, but I immediately raised my hand, slicing through the air with sharp, absolute authority. "You will not speak right now," I commanded. "You have spent my entire life telling me exactly what my place is. Tonight, you are going to sit there and listen to me." I walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. For 10 agonizing years, I have been the designated draft horse of this family. I pulled the heavy plow through the mud while Cameron paraded around the show ring, wearing blue ribbons he never actually earned. I sacrificed my entire youth for that company. I missed my own birthdays. I slept on a freezing concrete warehouse floor during the winter of our second year to ensure the heating system didn't break and destroy our entire inventory. I fought ruthlessly with international suppliers. I navigated devastating global shipping strikes entirely on my own. I built an absolute fortress of wealth from nothing but dirt and pure, sheer determination. I paused, standing directly behind Cameron's chair. He stiffened visibly, his shoulders hiking up to his ears, but he didn't dare turn around to face me. "And what was my reward for all that blood and sweat?" I asked the silence. Every single time I achieved a massive corporate milestone, Arthur would casually take all the credit at his exclusive country club dinners. He would tell his rich friends that he was the mastermind. And you, Margaret, you would constantly pull me aside and tell me not to brag about my massive profit margins, because it might make Cameron feel deeply insecure about his latest failed internet venture. I was expected to continuously shrink myself to make him look taller. I was expected to hide my brilliance so his absolute, staggering mediocrity wouldn't look so painfully obvious to the rest of the world. I walked back to my side of the table, looking down at the lavish Thanksgiving feast that was now growing completely cold and unappetizing. It looked exactly like our family. beautiful and perfect on the absolute surface, but entirely dead and cold underneath. You look at my life, and you see a barren woman with no legacy because I do not have a child, I said, locking eyes with my mother. You think my existence is somehow tragic, but you are completely blind to reality. My legacy is a multi-million-dollar international supply chain network. My legacy is the absolute financial independence that allows me to stand in this room and watch the three of you panic because you can no longer financially control me. I do not need a husband or a biological child to validate my existence in this world. And I certainly do not need to sacrifice my hard-earned empire to act as a permanent financial safety net for a 31-year-old man-child who cannot even balance a basic corporate ledger. Cameron flinched violently at the insult, but he kept his eyes glued to the expensive rug. Simone, who was still standing near the edge of the room, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod of total agreement. You wanted to be the chief executive officer, Cameron, I said, my tone dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. You wanted the prestigious corner office and the massive salary and the unearned respect. Well, congratulations. You officially have the title. You eagerly signed the paperwork. But a real executive doesn't cry and beg his sister to fix his monumental mistakes. A real executive deals with the angry commercial landlord. A real executive faces the federal tax auditors. You wanted the heavy crown so desperately, and now you get to feel exactly how much it weighs as it snaps your neck. I turned my fierce gaze back to my parents. I will never merge my Delaware corporation back into your worthless, bankrupt shell. I will never bring my loyal clients back to an entity controlled by people who willingly steal from their own blood. You can cry and you can scream and you can try to manipulate me with the sacred concept of family loyalty. But family loyalty is a two-way street. You burned the bridge. You completely salted the earth, and now you are crying because you have absolutely nothing left to eat. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my silk blouse. I am officially done. I am completely done being your workhorse. I am done funding this toxic, sickening illusion of a perfect family. You created this massive financial disaster entirely on your own, and you will survive it on your own. My legacy is walking out that front door and never looking back. I picked up my designer purse from the floor beside my chair. The heavy silence in the dining room was absolute. My father stared blankly at the wall. My brother stared miserably at the floor. Simone was still clutching her handbag, looking like she was ready to go to war and burn the entire house down. I turned on my heel, the sound of my shoes sharp against the polished wood, and took my first step toward the grand foyer. I was finally leaving this toxic prison for good. And then the doorbell rang. The loud electronic chime echoed through the massive house, cutting violently through the suffocating tension. It was exactly 8:00 at night on Thanksgiving. Nobody expected any guests. The sudden, sharp noise made Cameron jump out of his chair like he had been physically shocked. My father blinked rapidly, pulling himself out of his defeated stupor. For a brief second, everyone just stared at the wide archway leading to the front door, completely paralyzed by the unexpected interruption. My mother was the first to react. Margaret had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of sweeping massive family traumas directly under the nearest expensive rug. The doorbell was her ultimate salvation. It was a golden excuse to instantly stop talking about federal tax fraud, corporate bankruptcy, and stolen retirement funds. She desperately needed an audience to play her absolute favorite role of the perfect, wealthy suburban hostess. "Oh my goodness," Margaret gasped loudly, her voice suddenly shifting an entire octave higher. "That must be the neighbors. The Harrisons said they might drop by after dinner to bring us some of their famous homemade pecan pie. We absolutely cannot let them see us looking like this." She moved with terrifying speed. Margaret frantically wiped the remaining fake tears from her cheeks using the back of her hands. She smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress and aggressively patted her perfectly styled hair back into place. She took a deep breath, physically forcing her facial features to rearrange themselves into a bright, welcoming smile. It was honestly chilling to witness how quickly she could switch from a weeping, manipulative victim to a glowing neighborhood socialite in less than 10 seconds. "Please, everyone, just compose yourselves," my mother hissed over her shoulder as she hurried out of the dining room toward the foyer. "Arthur, fix your tie right now. Cameron, wipe your face. You are sweating profusely. We will deal with this ridiculous business nonsense after the guests leave." I stopped walking and simply stood in the archway, watching her. I wasn't going to run away out the back door. I wanted to see exactly how she planned to act like everything was perfectly fine while her precious family empire burned to the ground right behind her. I crossed my arms and waited. Margaret reached the large double front doors. She unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door wide open, ready to loudly welcome her wealthy country club neighbors with open arms. "Happy Thanksgiving," she sang out, her voice dripping with fake honey. But it wasn't the Harrisons standing on the front porch. There was no homemade pecan pie. The harsh porch light illuminated a single, solitary figure standing in the freezing autumn air. It was a man. He looked to be in his late 40s, completely unremarkable in almost every way. He wasn't dressed for a festive holiday dinner. He was wearing a plain, cheap gray suit that looked slightly wrinkled from sitting in a car for too long. He had a thick, dark winter coat pulled tight against the wind, and he was holding a very thick, heavily taped manila envelope under his left arm. Margaret froze, her bright smile instantly faltering. The sheer contrast between her lavish, formal dining room and the cold, professional demeanor of the stranger on her porch was completely jarring. A gust of cold wind blew a few dead autumn leaves across the marble threshold. "Oh," she stammered, taking a half step back into the house. "I am sorry. I thought you were someone else. Can I help you?" The man didn't smile back. He didn't offer any warm holiday greetings. He simply looked down at a small digital device in his hand, verifying the address of the massive suburban mansion. He looked back up at my mother, his expression completely blank and entirely focused on his specific task. He was clearly a man who was used to interrupting family dinners. "Good evening, ma'am," the man said, his voice flat and perfectly practiced. "I am looking for a specific individual. Can you please confirm if this is the primary legal residence of Cameron?" My mother tightened her grip on the edge of the heavy wooden door. Her maternal instinct suddenly flared up, replacing her fake hostess persona with deep suspicion. "Who is asking?" she demanded, her voice returning to its normal, cold, defensive tone. "I am an independent contractor," the man replied, stepping slightly closer to the threshold. "I have been strictly instructed to make direct physical contact. Is he currently on the premises tonight?" Cameron, who had been nervously hovering near the dining room table, heard his name. He stepped out into the grand foyer, his face still pale and glistening with anxious sweat. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights. "Who is it, Mom?" Cameron called out, walking slowly toward the open door. "What is going on?" The man in the plain suit didn't even acknowledge my mother. His eyes completely bypassed her fake hostess smile and locked directly onto my brother, who was standing just a few feet away. The contractor stepped smoothly past the threshold, invading the pristine grand foyer of my parents' massive suburban home without a single ounce of hesitation. He held the thick manila envelope out in front of him like it was a loaded weapon. "Are you Cameron?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the heavy tension like a sharp knife. Cameron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked at my mother and then back at the stranger. "Yes," he answered, his voice barely a whisper. "I am Cameron. What is this about?" The man didn't offer an explanation. He simply thrust the heavy envelope directly into Cameron's chest, forcing my brother to grab it before it fell to the floor. "You have officially been served," the man said, entirely devoid of emotion. "Have a pleasant Thanksgiving." Without another word, the man turned around, walked back out into the cold autumn night, and firmly pulled the heavy double door shut behind him. The loud click of the brass deadbolt locking into place sounded like a prison cell slamming shut. Cameron stood frozen in the middle of the foyer, holding the thick envelope with both hands like it was covered in toxic poison. My mother stared at the closed door, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. My father slowly walked out of the dining room, his heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Simone followed closely behind him, her eyes narrowed in deep suspicion. "Open it," Arthur commanded, his voice rough and completely stripped of his usual arrogant confidence. "Open it right now and tell me exactly what it says." Cameron fumbled with the heavy tape sealing the top of the envelope. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the entire package. He finally managed to rip the thick paper open and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. The pages were covered in bold black text and stamped with the official seal of the state commercial court. Cameron stared at the first page. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the legal jargon. As he read, the remaining blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like an absolute ghost. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean against the foyer wall just to keep himself standing upright. "What is it?" Simone demanded, taking a step closer to him. "Stop reading it to yourself and tell us what you just got served with." "It's the landlord," Cameron choked out, his voice cracking horribly. "The commercial real estate conglomerate that owns the main warehouse. They filed an emergency legal injunction this afternoon." My father grabbed the papers directly out of Cameron's shaking hands. Arthur quickly scanned the document, his face twisting into a mask of pure, absolute horror. I walked slowly out of the dining room and leaned against the doorframe, watching the final piece of my trap snap perfectly into place. "When you filed the corporate transfer documents this morning, Cameron," I said, my voice echoing calmly in the large, open space, "you triggered an automatic legal clause in the commercial lease agreement. The landlord requires the primary guarantor to have a proven, pristine credit history to maintain the massive square footage of that facility. You have absolutely no corporate credit history, and your personal credit score is a complete disaster due to those failed internet investments you hid from your wife." Simone let out a sharp, bitter laugh, covering her mouth in sheer disbelief. "The automated risk assessment software flagged the transfer immediately," I continued, watching my father read the exact words I was saying. "The real estate conglomerate instantly realized the new chief executive officer was an incredibly high-risk tenant. And because they know the lucrative vendor contracts are suddenly gone, they are not taking any chances with their property. They are demanding a massive security deposit," my father read aloud, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "Because the new tenant failed the mandatory financial background check, the landlord is legally invoking the emergency protection clause." "How much?" Simone asked, her voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "How much do they want?" Arthur looked up, his eyes wide and panicked. $200,000, he whispered. "They are demanding a certified cashier's check for exactly $200,000 by Monday morning at 9:00. And if he doesn't pay it," Simone pressed, stepping right into my father's personal space. "What happens on Monday morning if your brilliant son doesn't hand them $200,000 in cash?" My father looked back down at the legal injunction, his hands shaking just as violently as Cameron's had. "If the funds are not fully secured by the deadline, the commercial landlord will instantly change the locks on the facility. They will legally seize every single physical asset inside the building, the delivery trucks, the sorting machines, everything. They will liquidate all of the equipment to cover the remaining balance of the broken lease." Cameron let out a pathetic whimpering sound, sliding slowly down the expensive wallpaper until he was sitting completely defeated on the cold hardwood floor of the grand foyer. The brilliant illusion of his massive corporate empire was now entirely dead. He possessed absolutely no clients. He possessed absolutely no operating cash. And by 9:00 on Monday morning, he wouldn't even possess a physical building to walk into. His beautiful, pregnant wife had openly promised to divorce him and strip away whatever equity remained in his personal assets. Our arrogant parents had completely drained his finances to line their own pockets. The absolute worst Thanksgiving of his entire life was finally culminating in his total, utter destruction. He simply stared blankly ahead into the void, entirely bankrupt. The silence in the grand foyer was broken only by the sound of Cameron's ragged, shallow breathing. But as the sheer reality of his impending destruction fully settled over him, something inside his fragile mind finally, completely snapped. The arrogant, entitled golden boy who had smirked at me over the Thanksgiving turkey just an hour ago completely vanished. He scrambled up from the hardwood floor, but his legs couldn't support his weight. Instead, he practically crawled across the expensive rug, closing the distance between us until he was directly at my feet. Cameron threw himself down onto his knees right in front of me. He reached out with his trembling, sweaty hands and grabbed the hem of my silk coat. "Alina, please," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail. "Please, you have to save me. You have the money. Your new corporation has the millions. You can easily write them a check on Monday morning and make this all go away. Please do not let them take everything." I looked down at the top of his perfectly styled hair, which was now completely ruined and plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. "Let go of my coat, Cameron," I commanded, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. He didn't let go. He gripped the expensive fabric tighter, burying his face into his hands as the tears freely flowed. "I will do anything," he begged, his words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "I will completely step down. I will publicly sign the company back over to you immediately. I will come to your new office and work for absolutely free. I will clean your personal office. I will scrub the warehouse floors on my hands and knees. I will take out the garbage every single night. Just please pay the commercial landlord. I cannot go to federal prison. I cannot lose everything I have." My father took a hesitant step forward, clearly horrified by the absolute pathetic sight of his only son begging like a stray dog. "Get up, Cameron," my father barked, trying to inject some authority back into the room. "Have some dignity. We will call the lawyers and figure this out." Cameron whipped his head around to look at our father, his face red and covered in tears. "There is nothing to figure out," he screamed, his voice echoing violently off the high ceiling. "You gave me a dead company, Arthur. You stole my money and you handed me a literal death sentence. There are no lawyers who can magically fix a massive commercial lease default by Monday morning. Alina is the only one with the operating capital." He turned back to me, looking up with those desperate, pathetic eyes. "Please, Alina," he whimpered again. "We are blood. We are family." I took a deliberate step backward, ripping the hem of my coat out of his sweaty grasp. "You stopped being my family the absolute second you tried to steal my life's work," I said, looking down at him with pure, cold disgust. "You wanted to be the chief executive officer, Cameron. You wanted the power and the prestige. Well, the heavy crown is entirely yours. Enjoy the empty warehouse before they completely lock you out of it." Suddenly, another sound cut through his pathetic sobbing. It was the sharp, heavy sound of expensive metal hitting polished wood. Everyone turned their heads back toward the dining room. Simone had walked back over to T.H. E. Thanksgiving table. She was standing perfectly straight, her face an absolute mask of cold, calculating resolve. She had just violently yanked her massive diamond wedding ring off her finger and slammed it directly onto the mahogany table, right next to the useless corporate transfer documents. Cameron gasped, scrambling slightly backward on the floor. "Simone, what are you doing?" he choked out, his eyes wide with fresh terror. Simone ignored him completely. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen a few times and lifted the device to her ear. We all stood there in absolute silence, listening to the line ring. "Hey, it's me, Simone," she said, her voice totally flat and strictly professional. "I need you to come pick me up at Arthur's house right now. No, do not get out of the car when you pull up. Just idle in the driveway. I am leaving immediately. Yes, everything is completely ruined. I will explain it all in the car." She ended the call and dropped the phone back into her purse. She zipped it shut with a loud, sharp sound that felt incredibly final. "Simone," Cameron pleaded, holding his hands out toward her. "Please don't walk out on me. Not tonight. We have a baby. We can rebuild this." Simone looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the floor of the foyer. Her expression held absolutely zero love and zero pity. "I am not rebuilding a single thing with a fraudulent, entitled coward," she said, her words slicing through the air like a razor blade. "I am calling my attorney first thing on Monday morning. I am officially filing for divorce, and I am aggressively pursuing full legal custody of my child. Do not try to call me. Do not try to follow me. You are completely dead to me, Cameron." With her final piece spoken, Simone turned on her heel and walked purposefully toward the heavy double doors. She simply opened the door, stepped out into the freezing autumn night, and left them all entirely behind to rot in the massive nightmare they had created for themselves. The freezing draft from the open door lingered in the grand foyer for a long moment. Cameron remained completely frozen on his hands and knees, staring blankly at the empty space where his furious wife had just stood. The silence in the house was absolute and suffocating. My mother didn't rush forward to comfort her precious golden boy. My father didn't offer a booming speech about family resilience. They were entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of their own greed. I walked past my pathetic brother without looking down at him. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as I made my way back into the formal dining room. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. The glowing warmth of the antique chandelier now felt harsh and incredibly unforgiving. The expensive Thanksgiving feast was totally ruined. Roasted turkey was cold. The crystal wine glasses were scattered haphazardly. The corporate transfer documents resting on the mahogany table looked like literal garbage. I picked up my heavy leather tote bag from the floor and placed it gently on the edge of the table. I stood perfectly straight, taking a deep breath of the sage-scented air. I casually brushed a stray crumb of bread off the fabric of my designer silk dress. I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness washing over my entire body. The massive, heavy chain of family obligation that had dragged me down for over 3 decades had finally snapped. I was no longer the unloved daughter trying desperately to earn a scrap of validation. I was no longer the invisible workhorse pulling the weight of their massive suburban egos. I reached my hand into the side pocket of my tote bag and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. I unzipped the gold zipper and pulled out a heavy metal fountain pen. The sound of the pen cap clicking off echoed loudly in the quiet room. My father slowly walked back into the dining room, his posture completely slumped. My mother followed right behind him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. They stopped at the edge of the table, watching me with expressions of pure defeat. "What are you doing?" Arthur asked, his voice completely hollow. He sounded like a man who had rapidly aged 20 years in a single hour. I didn't answer him immediately. I laid the checkbook flat on the polished mahogany wood. I smoothed out the crisp paper of the top check. I pressed the metal tip of the fountain pen against the paper and began to carefully write. I wrote out the current date. I wrote the legal name of my father, Arthur. And then I carefully wrote out the exact numerical amount, $50,000. $5 years ago, I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the silence. I came to you asking for help. I needed a cosigner for a commercial lease to start my business. You graciously provided your signature to secure a $50,000 loan. You then aggressively used that single signature to legally bind me to your abs. Absolute control. You held it over my head at every single family gathering. You used it as justification to constantly claim my hard-earned success as your own personal victory. You used it as the ultimate excuse to steal my company today. I signed my name at the bottom of the check with a sharp, definitive flourish. I capped the fountain pen and slipped it back into my tote bag. I gripped the edge of the check and tore it away from the binding with a loud, satisfying rip. I held the crisp piece of paper in my hand for a brief second. I looked at my father, who was staring at the check with a mixture of confusion and absolute dread. I reached across the table, holding the check directly over the centerpiece of their lavish holiday meal. I opened my fingers and let the paper fall. The check fluttered down through the air and landed directly on top of the cold, ruined Thanksgiving turkey. It sat there resting against the glazed skin, an absolute symbol of our shattered family dynamic. "There is the initial loan you gave me 5 years ago, Arthur," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "That is exactly $50,000, drawn directly from my personal corporate account. It clears every single financial debt I have ever owed you. You can use it to help pay off your son's massive commercial lease default, or you can put it back into your luxury retirement fund. I honestly do not care what you do with it." I zipped my tote bag closed and placed the strap over my shoulder. My mother let out a small, pathetic whimper, covering her mouth. I looked at both of them one last time, committing their defeated faces to memory. "Paid in full," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "We are entirely done." I turned my back on them without waiting for another response. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I didn't rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who had just conquered an entire kingdom and was casually strolling out of the burning castle. Behind me, the absolute silence of the dining room finally broke. It shattered like a pane of brittle glass under the sheer weight of my mother's escalating hysteria. "Elena," Margaret shrieked, her voice vibrating with an ugly, desperate rage. "If you walk out that door, you are completely dead to us. Do you hear me? You are absolutely dead to this family. We will never speak to you again. We will completely erase you from our lives." Her desperate threats echoed off the high ceilings of the grand foyer, but they felt entirely weightless. They were just empty words thrown by a powerless woman who had finally run out of ammunition. I didn't slow my pace. I didn't turn my head to look back at her. I simply reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled the heavy double doors open and stepped directly over the marble threshold. The contrast between the stifling, toxic atmosphere of that house and the outside world was absolutely staggering. The crisp, cool autumn air hit my face instantly, clearing the lingering scent of roasted turkey and heavy, expensive perfume from my lungs. It was completely dark outside. The suburban street was incredibly quiet. The tall oak trees lining the perfectly manicured lawns rustled gently in the cold November wind. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I stood on the front porch for a moment, pulling my heavy silk coat tighter around my shoulders. Through the thick glass of the front door, I could hear the muffled sounds of absolute chaos finally erupting inside the house. My father had apparently found his voice again and was loudly shouting at Cameron. Cameron was screaming right back, crying hysterically about the commercial lease default. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her wails piercing through the heavy wooden door. The perfect, wealthy family was literally tearing itself apart in the foyer, and I was standing on the outside, completely untouchable. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the freezing air. The cold felt sharp and pure against my skin. For my entire life, I had been taught to fear this exact moment. I had been conditioned to believe that losing my family would be the ultimate tragedy. But standing there on the porch listening to them destroy each other, I realized I hadn't lost anything of actual value. I had only lost a group of incredibly selfish parasites who viewed my existence entirely as a financial utility. I had shed a massive, suffocating skin. I walked slowly down the brick pathway toward the driveway. My luxury SUV was parked neatly at the curb, reflecting the warm glow of the streetlights. As I approached my car, I noticed Simone's vehicle idling a few houses down the street. She was sitting in the passenger seat of her sister's sedan, staring straight ahead. She didn't look back at the massive house either. We were both survivors of the exact same shipwreck, swimming away from the sinking vessel in entirely different dyark. Tians, I unlocked my car and opened the heavy driver's side door. The plush leather interior smelled like expensive, clean cedar. It smelled like my own hard work. It smelled like complete, absolute independence. As I slid into the driver's seat and pushed the ignition button, the powerful engine roared to life with a low, satisfying rumble. I turned on the heated seats, feeling the sudden rush of warmth radiating through my tense muscles, contrasting beautifully with the bitter November cold lingering on my skin. I gripped the smooth leather steering wheel. My hands were perfectly steady. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settling deep into my bones. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. I deliberately adjusted my rearview mirror slightly upward so I wouldn't have to take one last, lingering glance at the massive brick colonial house that had been my absolute prison for 34 years. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the road ahead of me. The dark suburban streets were completely empty, lit only by the occasional warm glow of a street lamp. The soft jazz playing on my car stereo provided the perfect soundtrack to my escape. Every single mile I drove put more permanent distance between my brilliant future and their miserable, toxic past. I turned the heater up and let out a long, slow exhale. The night was incredibly dark, but for the first time in my entire adult life, I could see my path absolutely clearly. I pressed my foot down firmly onto the gas pedal. I drove into the calm night, leaving the absolute worst Thanksgiving of my life entirely behind me forever. Exactly 1 month has passed since that night. They say that karma is a slow-moving train, but in my family's case, it arrived with the speed and destructive force of a massive freight locomotive. The spectacular collapse of my arrogant brother and my deeply manipulative parents didn't just happen over a few years. It happened over a matter of days. On that following Monday morning at exactly 9:00, the commercial real estate landlord executed the emergency injunction. Cameron, of course, didn't have the $200,000 cashier's check. He showed up to the massive logistics facility in his expensive tailored suit, only to find private security guards standing outside the chained gates. They didn't let him inside to clean out his desk. They simply handed him a formal notice of asset seizure. The massive fleet of delivery trucks, the automated sorting machines, and the entire physical infrastructure of the limited liability company were immediately liquidated to cover the broken commercial lease. By Wednesday afternoon, OmniFlow Logistics LLC officially filed for absolute Chapter 7 bankruptcy. But the financial nightmare for Cameron was only just beginning. Simone was a woman of her absolute word. At 8:00 that same Monday morning, she filed an emergency petition for divorce. During the brutal discovery process, her aggressive attorneys entered the bright red folder of corporate credit card receipts into the public court record. The judge was absolutely unimpressed by a man who secretly mortgaged his marital home to buy an empty company, while simultaneously buying a $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet for a completely different woman. Simone ruthlessly stripped him of every single remaining asset. She forced the immediate sale of their luxury property and walked away with 100% of the remaining equity. She completely secured full legal custody of her unborn child, leaving Cameron with nothing but supervised visitation rights and a mountain of personal debt. Simone, meanwhile, just closed a record-breaking commercial real estate deal and bought herself a beautiful new townhouse downtown, entirely erasing his last name from all of her professional branding. My parents desperately tried to protect their golden boy. When the Internal Revenue Service inevitably caught wind of the rapid bankruptcy and the highly questionable corporate expenses, they initiated a massive forensic audit. Arthur, arrogant as always, hired the most expensive corporate defense attorneys in the state to fight the federal government and keep his precious son out of a federal penitentiary. But elite legal representation costs an absolute fortune. When the dust finally settled and the massive legal bills came due, Arthur and Margaret realized they were completely trapped in the financial nightmare they had helped create. To pay off the heavy federal tax penalties and the astronomical lawyer fees, my parents were forced to completely drain their luxury retirement trust fund. But even that massive amount of cash wasn't enough. 2 weeks ago, the massive brick colonial mansion with the manicured lawn and the high ceilings, the exact same house where they had smugly tried to steal my life's work, was quietly put on the real estate market. They had to sell their beautiful, pristine fortress just to keep Cameron from wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. They currently live in a cramped 2-bedroom condominium on the far edge of the city. Arthur had to completely resign his prestigious membership at the elite country club. The same wealthy men he used to brag to about his massive business acumen now actively avoid eye contact with him. Margaret had to drop out of her exclusive social clubs, entirely humiliated by their spectacular fall from grace. As for the brilliant chief executive officer himself, Cameron finally got to experience the harsh reality of the actual working class, without my massive corporate umbrella to hide under, and without our parents' deep pockets to constantly bail him out. He had to find a way to pay his court-mandated spousal support. Last Tuesday, I sent one of my junior supply chain managers to a local home improvement store to pick up some basic office supplies. She came back and told me she saw Cameron. He was wearing a bright blue polyester vest with a plastic name tag pinned to his chest, working a minimum-wage retail job in the plumbing aisle. The man who confidently told me I was relieved of my duties was now spending his days stocking heavy boxes of PVC pipes for $15 an hour. He has a manager who is 10 years younger than him, barking orders over a cheap walkie-talkie. He spends his long shifts sweeping the cold concrete floors and apologizing to angry customers, while Cameron spends his days apologizing to angry retail customers over discounted plumbing supplies. My own daily reality has moved in an entirely different and brilliant direction. I am currently standing in the center of my brand new corporate headquarters. When I officially dissolved my ties with the toxic family limited liability company, I didn't just relocate my massive physical assets. I completely relocated my entire life. I moved OmniFlow worldwide to a sleek, modern high-rise building right in the beating heart of Manhattan. My new corner office is absolutely nothing like the small, dark room Simone so viciously mocked at that disastrous dinner. It features massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offer a breathtaking, panoramic view of the iconic New York City skyline. The afternoon sunlight pours into the massive, open-concept workspace, reflecting beautifully off the polished white marble floors. We even brought in vibrant green plant installations to match our eco-friendly corporate branding, breathing an undeniable sense of life and vitality into the space. It is a brilliant, open environment designed for genuine growth and collaborative innovation, not for family manipulation and endless petty power struggles. Today is the day before the official Thanksgiving holiday, and the atmosphere in my office is absolutely electric. But we are not working on complex supply chain logistics today. Instead, I am hosting a massive, lavish Friendsgiving celebration for my entire dedicated staff and the true friends who actually supported me. I brought in a premium local catering company to set up a massive, beautiful buffet of roasted turkey, garlic mashed potatoes, and fresh seasonal vegetables right in the center of our executive boardroom. The air smells like cinnamon apple cider and genuine, unadulterated happiness. The food is completely different from the dry turkey and tense silence of last year. We have fresh cranberry sauce, pumpkin pies, and an incredible spread of artisan cheeses. Everyone is encouraged to eat as much as they want and to take plenty of delicious leftovers home to their families. I look around the spacious room and see the smiling faces of the people who actually matter. These are the loyal senior managers, the brilliant tech developers, and the dedicated warehouse supervisors who immediately resigned from the old company the exact second I told them I was leaving. They trusted my leadership so completely that they followed me to the new Delaware corporation without a single moment of hesitation. They are laughing, sharing funny stories, and raising crystal glasses of champagne. There is no underlying toxic tension. There are no secret malicious agendas. There is absolutely no one sitting at this Thanksgiving table secretly plotting to steal my hard-earned equity. My lead software engineer, a brilliant young woman who helped me code the proprietary routing algorithm, walks over and hands me a fresh glass of sparkling cider. She clinks her glass against mine and offers a warm, genuine smile. "We have a lot to be thankful for this year, Alina," she says, her voice filled with sincere gratitude. I take a slow sip of the sweet drink and look down at the sleek digital tablet resting on my glass desk. She is absolutely right. We have an incredible amount of things to celebrate. Just this morning, I completely finalized the complex legal paperwork for a massive Series A funding round. A major venture capital firm based out of Silicon Valley had been aggressively tracking my impressive corporate restructuring. They saw exactly how efficiently I pivoted the entire business model and legally retained every single top-tier commercial client. They were so incredibly impressed with my ruthless efficiency and my flawless financial ledgers that they officially valued OmniFlow worldwide at over $50 million. They just wired $15 million of liquid operating capital directly into my corporate accounts to help us aggressively expand our infrastructure into the European market. I am no longer just surviving the daily grind of running a local suburban warehouse. I am actively building a massive international empire completely on my own terms. I do not have a narcissistic father looming over my shoulder, constantly claiming credit for my brilliant negotiations. I do not have a manipulative mother telling me to shrink my ambitions to protect a fragile male ego. I am the sole founder and the undisputed chief executive officer, and absolutely nobody can ever take that away from me again. I walk over to the massive glass window and look down at the busy city streets far below. Millions of people are rushing around, living their own complex lives. A year ago, I was completely suffocating under the heavy, oppressive weight of family expectations. I believed that my own massive success was somehow a terrible burden that I had to constantly apologize for just to keep the peace. But standing here, I am entirely free. I slowly look away from the massive window and turn back to face my amazing team. The beautiful sounds of their laughter and the clinking of their glasses fill the room. This is what a real family looks like. For so long, I was aggressively conditioned to believe that family was strictly defined by biology and shared last names. I was taught that blood was a binding contract that forced you to endlessly tolerate disrespect, manipulation, and outright theft. Society constantly tells us that we must forgive our relatives simply because we share the same genetic makeup. But that is a complete and absolute lie. True family is not an obligation you are born into. It is a conscious choice you make every single day. True family celebrates your massive victories instead of actively trying to diminish them to protect their own fragile insecurities. True family does not view your hard work as a communal bank account to be raided whenever they make a terrible personal decision. Looking back at that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, I realized something incredibly profound. When people hear my story, they immediately assume that my greatest revenge was the flawless corporate trap I set. They think the ultimate payoff was watching my brother completely lose his mind over the commercial lease default, or watching my parents aggressively drain their luxury retirement fund to keep him out of federal prison. The financial ruin and the total collapse of their fake suburban empire was definitely a satisfying consequence of their own unbridled greed. But the money was never the actual point. The greatest and most exquisite revenge I ever achieved was the quiet realization that I simply no longer care what any of them think about me. For 34 years, my entire sense of self-worth was entirely tethered to their conditional approval. I built a multi-million-dollar logistics company just hoping my father would finally look at me with genuine pride. I bought expensive gifts and funded luxury vacations, hoping my mother would finally stop comparing me to my utterly useless brother. Their opinions dictated my happiness, and their constant criticism kept me locked in an invisible psychological cage. But the exact second I walked out of their front door and stepped into the freezing autumn air, that heavy chain completely shattered. I do not care if my father thinks I am a ruthless traitor. I do not care if my mother tells her former country club friends that I am a terrible, ungrateful daughter. Their voices no longer play on a continuous loop inside my head. Their judgment holds absolutely zero power over my reality. I evicted them from my mind, and the profound silence they left behind is the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced. There is an incredible, liberating power in finally accepting that some people are simply committed to misunderstanding your value. You cannot negotiate with parasites. You cannot reason with emotional leeches who only view you as a convenient stepping stone for their own selfish ambitions. When you finally stop pouring your precious energy into toxic relationships that offer absolutely nothing but continuous pain, you create massive open spaces for genuine growth. You redirect that immense power back into yourself. If you are watching this video right now, and you are currently feeling trapped by the heavy, suffocating weight of a toxic family dynamic, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your life to people who actively refuse to respect you. You do not owe your hard-earned success to relatives who only reach out when they need a financial bailout. You are allowed to set ironclad boundaries. You are allowed to pack your bags, walk out the front door, and absolutely never look back. Do not let anyone weaponize your own guilt against you. Cut off the toxic leeches who are draining your potential and use that exact same energy to aggressively build your own magnificent empire. You deserve to sit at a table where your presence is genuinely celebrated, not just financially tolerated. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic family member to finally protect your own peace? How did it completely change the trajectory of your life? I would love to read all about your personal triumphs and your own stories of sweet revenge in the comments section below. If my journey resonated with your own experiences, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more authentic stories about resilience, boundary setting, and massive personal growth. Share this video with someone who desperately needs the courage to finally choose themselves today. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that the best revenge is always building a wildly successful life completely without them. The story we just explored reveals a hard and deeply uncomfortable truth about human relationships. We are often taught from a very young age that family loyalty is an absolutely unbreakable contract. Society conditions us to believe that sharing a bloodline means we must endlessly tolerate disrespect, manipulation, and even outright betrayal. But Alina and her incredible journey completely shatters that dangerous illusion. The most profound lesson hidden within the wreckage of her family Thanksgiving dinner is that true loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your own self-worth or completely fund the failures of those who refuse to respect you. For over a decade, Alina played the role of the reliable, invisible workhorse. She continuously dimmed her own brilliance to protect the fragile ego of her entitled brother and accepted the absolute bare minimum of love from her narcissistic parents. But her ultimate victory was not the brilliant corporate trap she laid or the massive financial ruin her family brought upon themselves. Her greatest triumph was the quiet, powerful realization that she no longer needed their conditional approval to validate her own existence. Walking away from toxic people, even when they are your own parents or siblings, is never an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. It takes immense courage to look directly at the people who were supposed to protect you and finally decide to protect yourself instead. When you completely stop pouring your precious energy into a bottomless pit of familial guilt, you finally create the necessary space to build a beautiful life. You make room for a chosen family filled with people who actively celebrate your massive success instead of plotting to steal it. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your own life and bravely cut ties with anyone who drains your peace so you can start building the brilliant future you actually deserve.